Leave aside all of the assumptions of Christian history and let's just look at the text afresh and consider every possibility. Let's open the whole game up.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Value Podcast with your host, Jacob Berman. Today, Dr. Blackhirst joins us once again, and we're not going to be talking about necessarily the Gospel of Barnabas or the Gnostic stuff. That was the topic of those are the topics of the first two videos that we did, respectively. And that being said, today we're going to be talking about his role in the documentary film Caesar's Messiah, which is about Joseph Atwill's book called Caesar's Messiah, the Roman conspiracy. It's about the Roman conspiracy to invent Jesus, to map out Jesus' life based on the military campaigns of Titus. And today, Dr. Blackhirst is going to talk about what he thinks about that hypothesis. He's going to talk about his role in the film, so on and so forth. So that being said, Dr. Rodney Blackhirst, take the mic. Tell us all about it.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, I was invited to contribute to that film because Joseph Atwill had been in contact with a friend of mine whose name was Clifford Carrington. And Carrington had locally, where I live, had sort of independently developed a theory of Christian origins to do with the Flavians, namely that the Christian religion, such as it became, was the outcome of deliberate policies of the Flavian dynasty. And all of that happened at the change of dynasty from the Julio-Claudians through to the Flavians. Joseph Atwill had developed a very similar sort of theory, namely that the Jesus figure was a mythological construction and that it was largely a result of deliberate Roman policy. So my role in that was subsidiary, really, because I was invited to explain that point of view, but really it was Cliff Carrington's point of view, or his particular theory. It's just that I followed him in his research over many years, and at the time, over about a decade or more, I also taught biblical studies, and so I was very interested in those sorts of theories, as well as other theories. I was interested in the whole field, but this was happening in that field at that time, and so I was happy to contribute to Joseph Atwill's film, just because I think that those sorts of theories should be on the table, and it should be we should have an open discussion about those sorts of things.
What do you think about his theory overall? How does it match up with the evidence?
Yeah, okay. There's several different versions of this theory, I have to say. What they all have in common is the idea that the Roman Imperium was actively involved in religion creating in that period. And I think that that's a fair surmise, because we can see that the Romans actively did this. They took an interest. They regarded religion as state policy. It's part of running the state, and we know from other instances that they took an active part in promoting particular cults or incorporating gods into their pantheon and so forth for various reasons. So I think that that premise is quite sound. Some people want to take that all the way and say that the entire edifice of Christianity was the result of Roman policy, and they put a very hard edge to that. They say that they portray that as an act of propaganda. So, they see it as an exercise in social engineering, I guess. And they put a very modern veneer on that. It's sort of like using religion as to suppress the masses type of thing. I think that that's not how I personally sort of understand those sorts of processes or the way that things worked in the ancient world. On the other hand, someone like Cliff Carrington had a had a more sober sort of view of it. He just wanted to point out that the Flavian dynasty, at the change of dynasties there, was actively involved in myth making, and that he thinks that those myths were propagated, were part of the legitimation process of the new dynasty, and that subsequently Christianity sort of took on a life of its own and became one of those Eastern cults that became very popular throughout the Roman Empire. And of course, this particular one prospered and won the day. Also on the fringes there, lots of these are regarded as fringe theories. Also on the fringes there are really out there theories like the Piso theory, which is also an account of how Christianity was the result of Roman intrigues. Yeah.
That theory I've tried to study, and there are advocates of that theory that have communicated with me in the past, and I get very confused because, as I'm sure you are aware of, it's claiming that Josephus Flavius is not his real name, and he's really some guy called Arius Calpurnius Piso.
Yeah.
And that's a name that somebody, this anonymous Piso guy, finds, I think, by using the Gospels, or and then he combines several characters into the same person. I think, if I remember correctly, he goes as far as identifying Paul, Josephus, even Jesus as being somehow the same person. And
in the Piso theory, there's an elaborate conspiracy that extends through the Roman nobility for many centuries. In fact, the subsequent work of what's his name, Abelard Rouchlin. That's obviously a pseudonym, Abelard Rouchlin. He seems to be. I've done a fair bit of digging into the Piso theory to try to get to the bottom of all of that. But yes, there's elaborate plays on names, especially Roman names, and of course Romans often had many names, and so names can be interchangeable. Even Flavius Josephus, he's taken the name Flavius because he was adopted into the imperial household. He's Jewish, and he has Jewish names, and he could be known by lots of different names. But in this particular case, in the Piso theory, there's lots of swapping of identities. So it's a highly elaborate sort of game that Abelard Rouchlin proposes to expose by a very, very careful reading of the texts. That's what he proposes to do. My suspicion is that the guy is a lawyer by profession or something like that, and that he's very accustomed to careful reading of texts.
So what do you find, like, in your research, what is, in other words, what evidence is for and against this the Roman origins of Christianity overall?
In general, on the one hand, there's the huge mass of Christian stuff, Christian literature. There's a lot of it, and Jewish. But on the other hand, the evidence for the hard historical evidence for early Christianity is, by any estimation, fairly thin. And so any theory that you put together is going to be fairly thin in terms of solid historical evidence. As for the Flavian theory, my view is that it's largely circumstantial evidence. It's a particular reading of that history, of saying, where could this have happened in this history? Where in this scope of this history could this have happened? And in Carrington's version of it, in any case, what he says is, look, this sort of myth making and this sort of manipulation of stories and texts and so forth is most likely to have happened at the change of dynasty. when there's the change from the Julio-Claudians to the Flavians in the wake of the Jewish War, and that's the circumstances in which it's likely to have happened. Then you go to the text and try to see what evidence there is in the text. And, you know, there's Carrington put together some fairly good textual evidence, or at least suggestive textual evidence. Otherwise, what you're depending upon, what every theory and everybody depends upon, is you know, the evidence of omission, stuff that's missing. So that, for instance, when we talk about early Christianity, the problem is that the texts don't really appear till fairly late. They're missing. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist. It just means we don't have any copies from those early periods. And so you're relying on stuff like that. You're relying on arguments that say that something didn't happen or something isn't there, rather than saying something is. So all of these, I think that that's just the nature of that type of history, and religious history in particular. And in this particular case, it's in a very difficult period of history where, you know, you're looking at the aftermath of the Jewish War, and things are fairly chaotic. There's the collapse of the Julio-Claudians. Things are fairly chaotic in that period. Yeah. So how solid's the evidence? Not very. It's largely circumstantial, I think. But then so too is the conventional narrative. The conventional narrative is very thin and depends upon particular readings of very suspect texts like the Flavian testimony and things like that. So nobody's got a very tight argument here. It's a question of which one do you think fits the evidence best, the surviving evidence best.
Joseph Atwill often, as you know, puts heavy emphasis on the parallels between Jesus's life and Titus's life, at least what he believes to be are parallels between the two. Now, he uses that as a foundation for the insertion, the house he puts over the foundation, that Jesus did not exist at all. What are your thoughts on that? Do you lean towards that there was a historical figure, which is the conventional thought of consensus scholars, or do you lean towards he didn't exist?
Yeah. That's really the question here, isn't it? That's sort of like where the two camps of scholars are sort of divided here, whether you're a mythicist or whether you're find a historical Jesus in the mix. My own leaning is towards a mythical sort of point of view. I think that the character is largely of a mythical sort of character, a mythical sort of type, but I don't discount the possibility that it's based on a historical character. But even then, I suspect, and I have reasons to suspect this from the Gospel of Barnabas, of all places, that you can mount an argument to say that Jesus is probably based upon earlier figures, such as the figure in the Dead Sea Scrolls, who's sometimes referred to as the teacher of righteousness. And other sort of religious heroes of the period. So he may be based upon a particular figure, but he's certainly undergone a transformation, namely that, you know, he's presented as an advocate of peace and turning the other cheek and so forth. And this is in a period of religious warfare and Jewish zealotry. I think it's largely a mythological construction. I don't favour Joe Atwill's identification of the life of Titus being an allegory of the life of Titus. I don't.
You mean Jesus being an allegory of the life of Titus?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't subscribe to that particular version of the mythical thing. Although I do. On the other hand, I do think that there's probably, it's very interesting, the Flavian input into the Christian myth. I think that that's a very interesting aspect of it. But personally, I think that Jesus is largely a mythological character that's been turned into history rather than the other way around. Traditionally, you look at it the other way around. You think that there's a historical character, and what's happened over a period of time that is the character's been mythologized and exaggerated and had miracles attached to him and all that sort of stuff. That's a very Protestant view of things that says that you can take away all that, demythologize all of that, and what you'll get at the end is the raw primitive Jesus, you know, the primitive Galilean. And for the whole bent of scholarship for decades was like that, looking for the historical Jesus by removing the mythological layers. But what if you take it the other way around? What if you say that the myth is there and that it's been turned into history, that it's solidified into historical events? Because that happens as well. You take a mythological thing and it becomes a historical thing in some accounts, and later on, you know, the Romans do this, lots of people do this. So it could go the other way. I tend to think that that's probably a better explanation for it, looking at the texts.
You brought up the teacher of righteousness earlier. Another person that's appeared in another well-known person that's appeared in the film is Professor Robert Eisenman, and I've interviewed him a couple of times.
Yeah,
and I will be interviewing him a third time soon. What do you think about his claims? Because he really gets the teacher of righteousness and his research involved in Christianity in so many ways. He makes him out to be James the Just, and puts
he does
the Habakkuk Pesher of a Damascus document, very well-known Dead Sea Scrolls, and puts them in the 1st century CE during the Herodian period.
That's correct. Yeah, he wrote that very substantial work on James, the brother of Jesus, and you know, that's the first really solid investigation of that character. And so I think that that's very good, and I like Robert Eisenman's work a lot. I think it's very suggestive and very fruitful. What he does with the scrolls and the dating and all of that, you know, we could quibble about lots of things like that. But what's clear here is that there's a whole bunch of characters. There's John the Baptist, there's James the Just, there's the teacher of righteousness, and Jesus of Nazareth. There's a whole bunch of characters in that period, and to some extent they seem to be interchangeable in our texts. You get a motif from John that is found in the teacher of righteousness. It's also found in James. You know, it's a lot of material seems to float between characters, and it's very hard to explain how that happens with texts. Robert Eisenman does a fantastic job trying to juggle so many balls at once in his work on James, and so I think it's a very impressive sort of work. Yeah. And very useful. I found it very useful.
What do you think about the identification, the teacher with James? You know.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I argued in an article many years ago that in the Gospel of Barnabas, which is a strange text to bring in here, you know, it's using a late medieval text but what you have there is a depiction, and I argue it through, that Jesus is clearly based upon the teacher of righteousness in that text. So that, for instance, in the Gospel of Barnabas, what happens is Jesus goes on a sojourn to Damascus. He's exiled to Damascus, and then he returns to Judea again, and it sort of echoes very clearly, even down to some of the imagery that's used. It echoes the famous story in the Damascus document and also in the Dead Sea Scrolls of the teacher of righteousness and his followers being exiled to Damascus and so forth. So that in that text, at least, it appears that that's the basis of Jesus, although in that text, Jesus is really a camouflage version of John the Baptist. So these characters are very complex. There's a lot of toing and froing happening in the text. It's amazing to watch. And you have to ask, why has this happened? How has this happened with these texts? These texts have been really worked over, and a lot of toing and froing between imagery. It's really quite amazing. Teacher of righteousness and James the Just. Certainly, they're very similar characters, and Eisenman's correct to point out the similarities and continuities, but whether they're the same person in the end or not, I don't know, or whether it's John the Baptist, or in the early days of the Dead Sea Scrolls, people identified the teacher of righteousness with John the Baptist. They said there were lots of similarities, largely because of the geographical proximity of the scrolls, I think. Eisenman makes a very good case for James the Just, and so on. Yeah, it's very difficult to tell.
Hmm. Another thing that's tackled in Joseph Atwill's theory is the dating of the New Testament. What I've been noticing, and the previous scholars that especially with the previous interviews I've done with other scholars, and the studies that I've done as well, slowly there seems to be a new form of dating of the New Testament, a realignment of the dating. Scholars are now saying that Luke Acts used Josephus, when previously they would not say that. They would place Luke Acts and John in the 2nd century, when before they would put it in the 1st century.
Yeah.
There are fewer scholars, but slowly growing on that end as well, that put Mark and Matthew in the 2nd century as well, especially those that hold the position of Marcionite priority. And the dating of Paul, there are a few that think that the dating of Paul is wrong and it's much later.
Yeah.
Which stance do you take on the dating? Because
I generally subscribe to late dating.
Okay.
Just because of all of the mixing up that you see in the texts, and the development of sort of mythological configurations in these stories, one tends to think that those things happen fairly remote from the actual events, remote from the period. They're mythologizing about a period, and that usually happens sort of some distance from the period. So I'm more comfortable with later dating. Yeah.
So like the writings of Paul.
Yeah.
When would you put that?
Yeah, I'd put them in the 2nd century. I'd put nearly all of this. I put all of this literature in the 2nd century, really, because, this was quite accepted in 19th century scholarship. That's a really amazing thing about biblical scholarship. In the 19th century, in the Tübingen School and Brouwer and people like that, they had extremely radical views on these sorts of things. What had happened there in the Germans is that they had honed their tools on Homer and the Greek and Roman classics. And then there came a point around, the 1840s or 50s or later, I think, where they turned those tools on the Greek early Christian texts, and using the same methods, that is the hard historical methods that they had applied to the classical text and Homer in particular, they came up with really extraordinary conclusions. They thought that Paul was all in the 2nd century, that Luke depended on Josephus, and so on. All of that scholarship sort of died. It all sort of disappeared after the after the Nazi period and all of that in Germany. When German scholarship resurfaced, it was much more conservative and much more conformist to sort of Lutheran standards and everything. And all of that radical scholarship of the 19th century disappeared. That radical dating disappeared, and ever since then, there's been these fights about, for instance, whether or not Acts depends upon Josephus. I think that on the face of it, it really does. It sort of clearly does, and that you have to work very, very hard, and scholars have, to try to explain that textual formation in Acts. I think the natural explanation is that Acts are written much later, but then that upsets a lot of other dating, and so on, and so it goes. You're much better off to put the dating, to admit a later dating and put it in the 2nd century somewhere.
So who do you think's responsible for Paul's epistles? Because I've heard similar arguments from those like Dr. Price, who who pretty much puts a good chunk of it at the hands of Marcion. Marcion got the train rolling.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. When you look at the drift of the history there, one of the things that really stands out there is Marcion. You think, what happened there? What happened there? Marcion must be the key to the introduction of a lot of that the formation of the New Testament, really, as distinct from the Hebrew Scriptures, as a separate and clearly defined body of material, separate from its Jewish origins. Marcion must have played a big role in that, and promoting Paul and that particular type of Gnostic view of things. Yeah,
I remember in my studies, and I looked at the scholarship, it always bugged me that when I look at the reasons for the dating, putting Paul in the 50s, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, 70, 80, 90, 100 CE. It's like, why? And even if you look at the epistles and say Paul wrote some of them, which is their position, that Paul wrote 7 out of the 13 Pauline epistles in the New Testament. Look at things like Galatians. It insinuates heavily that it was written a long time after Paul, James, and Cephas argued. That Paul had an argument with those two, Cephas and James, and it's like it'll say it's like 3 years later he returned to Jerusalem. Then 14 more years passed. I'm like, so a lot of times it's flying in Galatians, and it doesn't look like it's taking place during the argument. That's at least that's how I read it, and as you agree with. So I'm like, and everything that bothers me is Clement of Rome, who supposedly wrote his letter to the Corinthians, First Clement.
Yes.
He mentions Paul. He seems to be the earliest person that mentions Paul, unless Robert Eisenman's right. Josephus mentioned Paul as Saul. I find his argument to be very interesting, and I so far I think he's correct about that, in my opinion.
Oh, who is Paul? I'm not sure. Paul's a very mysterious character, isn't he?
That's true. Acts claims Saul is Paul, and
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Right. But what I found strange about Clement is he says Paul wrote the epistle. It almost sounds like one letter.
Yeah.
So what are the other letters?
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. It's just not there. I'm like, that's odd. And Tertullian, as Dr. Price has noted, says that Marcion had discovered the epistle to the Galatians. What do you think of that statement? Tertullian saying that Marcion just suddenly found Galatians.
Just suddenly found them. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very hard to establish the context. One of the things I will say here is that Tertullian and the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and it's an extraordinarily in-house literature. It's an extraordinary closed literature, that Christian literature. When you can take any character from in that literature and try to find them outside of Christian literature. Paul, for instance. Try to find Tertullian, try to find Justin Martyr. These were supposedly important people who became Christians, converted to Christianity, and became, significant thinkers in early Christianity. But it's very hard to corroborate any of those characters as historical people. It's a very, very strange sort of literature in that way. It's a very enclosed literature. And I'm not sure why that is. And I can't think of other literatures that do that, but there may be others.
The other thing that bothers me is when I look at the Dutch radical argument that Paul wrote nothing, none that we have in the New Testament, is that if we start admitting that this book and that book in the New Testament read Josephus, then it opens a can of worms, and you start thinking, what if all the authors read Josephus? And once you open the can of worms, that's what convinces me that scholarship is eventually going to return to that thinking, because they're opening that can of worms back. And if the author or authors of the Pauline epistles had read Josephus, one could easily argue that the connections between Paul, like the similarities between Paul and the Saul character in Josephus, are due to them having read Josephus, and not because the Saul and Josephus wrote anything.
Indeed.
But Professor Eisenman's parallels, the parallels he shows between Saul and Paul, may be due to a different reason than he thinks. Like the author of Romans say it's a forgery. Says he's a kinsman to Herod's, and just before that, Romans 16:10, he says is the Herodian identifications in Romans 16:11 says greetings Aristobulus, and we know there's a few Aristobuluses in the Herodian household, and then the Acts thing saying, well, actually Saul became Paul. One could argue the author of Acts knew that the authors of the epistles are borrowing the ideas of Paul from reading Josephus, reading about the Saul guy. But the Saul guy in Josephus is, although similar, very different. He's very different in other ways.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's going on that needs to be appreciated here is that, yes, they're sort of making allegorical readings of characters and historical events and so forth, but more importantly, they're reading those in parallel through Old Testament proof texts. So that in this case, for instance, Paul and Saul, there are allusions all the way through those stories and the whole life of Paul in lots of ways back to the book of Samuel and back to Saul and various passages and proof texts that you can find in the Hebrew scriptures there. And this is happening all the time, so that when you take a character and you're, say, a historical character, and you fictionalize their persona or something like that, you may also reshape it in order to fit an Old Testament legitimation, an Old Testament proof text. And the whole, in some ways, you can take the whole ministry of Jesus and reconstruct it from Old Testament proof texts. Just about everything he says,
comes from the Old Testament.
Is rooted in the Old Testament. And this is true also of things like the passage where Paul changes Saul changes his name to Paul and things like that. It's really helpful to go back in all of those passages to the Old Testament echoes of that, because I think the authors are using the Old Testament there.
And Paul saying in the epistles, even before Acts, he's saying, or the character is alleged to have said that he is a Benjamite. And I'm like,
yes, yeah, that's right.
That's one of the striking statements that makes me like the offer, that makes me think about the Paul being thought of in the epistles and the Paul being thought of in Acts. They are thinking about the same character, and that's why Acts says he's Saul turned into Paul, which follows in line with the statement that he claims to be a Benjamite. And you got a Saul and Josephus, because in 66E, as Eisenman points out, when he flees Jerusalem, Herod's palace, with his brother Costobarus, just the passage right after this is in Josephus, the Jews start going after those they call traitors in the land of Damascus, like a Damascus persecution. And it reminded me of the flight from Damascus, that Paul takes in 2 Corinthians, but Paul makes a huge error. Says King Aretas IV ruled Damascus, which many scholars have admitted, no, he didn't. King Aretas III did 100 years earlier, and the Romans took over Damascus in the 60s BCE. And I've heard some critics try to say of that idea, like, oh, no, come on. King Aretas IV had a tetrarch at Damascus. Wait a minute. That you're saying that doesn't mean he's ruling Damascus? A tetrarch is a vassal of his. So it's like saying it's as idiotic to me as saying Paul, excuse me, not Paul. It's saying that the Romans didn't control Judea, Pilate did. That's right. Stupid.
That's right. That's right. Although those texts are very tight, though. I mean, they fit. They're very well crafted and very constructed. So there aren't many mistakes in there, but there are some. That's some of Paul makes historical errors.
Some that the Aretas thing is a very huge blunder in the suspicious scenario that he's lowered from a basket while fleeing from Aretas.
That's right.
Doesn't that sound like Moses, or is that just me thinking that Moses is?
No, there are Old Testament echoes all the way through the stories, and the writers are very, very good at those. They're very good at those. And I learned this even from the Gospel of Barnabas. Is a really interesting text because it's an anti-Pauline text. Anyone that's interested in Paul should make themselves familiar with the Gospel of Barnabas, such as it is, because it's an explicitly anti-Pauline text. And so, for instance, the Benjaminite aspect of Paul and various other aspects of Paul, those proof texts that the Paul legend has been based upon, the Gospel of Barnabas systematically undoes them. And that's really interesting to watch. The author of the medieval Barnabas, he knows his proof text, he knows the scriptures, he knows what Paul's teachings are based upon, and he goes back and he presents a different set of proof texts. It's really interesting to watch how you construct a gospel from a set of Old Testament proof texts.
Because when I look at the dating, I decided to, like, okay, I respect the opinions of the other scholars that say otherwise, but the late dating seems to fit better with the text, and the contradictions in Paul's epistles, and the fact that the epistles admit more than one person wrote them, like at least I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, 6 of them admit they are written by 2 or even 3 people, depending on which, like Silas, Paul, and Timothy, Sosthenes and Paul, or Paul and Timothy. It's like, okay, something's going on there.
Well, something's going on in general in this period. I mean, there's a huge explosion of literature, and it's a very interesting and complex sort of literature. The problem here, though, is that we're looking at text, and we don't have much in terms of stones and mortar. We don't have early churches. We don't have any tombs. We don't have any graves. We don't have anything really solid. We're going on texts. It's a very textual history. The archaeology doesn't really begin until the late 2nd century, when you start getting Christian tombs in Rome, and even then, they don't fit the narrative because they're upper class. They're upper class citizens. The narrative that Christianity begins from the lower classes and that it comes up through the
higher class.
That doesn't seem to have been the case. The archaeology suggests that it was different than that. But all the same, the archaeology begins very late. And it depends how you judge that evidence. How satisfied are you with textual evidence without solid archaeological evidence to back it up? That becomes part of the question here. It'd be nice to find some inscriptions on stone of John the Baptist, or whatever, but we don't have anything like that.
Yeah, that's very true. What do you think caused the inception, what was the primary cause of the inception of the New Testament in the 2nd century, from your point of view?
Mm. It must be connected with the settlement of the Old Testament too, with the canon, the formation of the canon of the Hebrew Scriptures. It must be connected with that at the same time. I think that they're roughly in the same period. And so what I think is involved there is some sort of settlement or accommodation of things into the new order of things in the. You've got to remember too that the Bar Kokhba revolt of the 2nd century was huge, and we don't have any literature of that. We don't have a Josephus that gave us an account of that. We're you know, we're really stuck on the first Jewish war because we've got such detailed account of it. But you know, in the 120s, everything went bad again, and there's a rebellion, and so I think the impetus is much the same as the canonization of the Jewish scriptures. After the destruction of the temple, everyone's got to reorganize. I think that's the main thing. The destruction of the temple is and I think the Bar Kokhba revolt is the final destruction of the temple, actually. There are coins with pictures of the temple from the Bar Kokhba period, you know, whether they're memories of the temple or whether the temple was still functioning in some form at that point is a matter of debate.
So when you look at that and you look at that way and you look at Joseph Atwill, which parts of the Roman origins theory which parts of it do you think is most likely true in tandem?
I think that I think it's probably true that the Romans, as well as conducting real warfare against the Jewish rebels in the Holy Land, they also, and the whole Jewish problem of Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire. I think that they promoted pro-Roman and pacifist forms of Judaism against zealotry. I think that they'd be silly if they didn't do that. They had control of literature. They had a fantastic amount of control of literature, so that they could control the narrative. So I think that was part of it. They were promoting that type of Gentile Judaism. Christianity is, you know, Judaism for Gentiles. They were promoting a more open form of Judaism against Jewish exclusivism. I think that all of that is true, that the Romans were actively doing that. I think that Josephus tells us that. He tells us that they were trying to work through that Jewish problem. You know, they asked Josephus, commissioned Josephus to write a history of the Jews for Roman intellectual class, things like that. I think that they're actively involved in that. How much further it goes than that, I'm not sure. I don't subscribe to the view that, you know, they were sort of trying to manipulate the Roman masses. They were trying to pacify a particular religious problem in the empire and the Eastern Empire, and it was a crucial matter because it was important for the Romans to hold the East. They didn't want constant rebellions over there. So I think that Christianity was promoted. It had some sort of state endorsement in any case. Yeah, it would have been favored by Christianity, by the Romans, as opposed to other forms of Jewish sectarianism anyway.
When it comes to the Son of Man descending from the clouds, because Joseph Atwill talks about a lot about this as well in both his book and the documentary film, and he equates him with Titus, because Titus, as Josephus talks about Roman soldiers, he saw Romans running around in the clouds, descending upon Jerusalem, and there comes Titus, and he equates the Son of Man with Titus. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Carrington does this too. Carrington is interested in there's a whole set of myths that are associated with the Flavians, because the Flavians don't have any legitimacy. I mean, they were army men, and they didn't come from Roman nobility, and so the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and they were gods, the Julio-Claudians. When the Flavians come to power, and really they're just elevated to power by the army, really it's a military takeover, that new dynasty. The army comes to power. The Flavians have to invent a whole mythology to explain and legitimize their dynasty. And Carrington's work was fantastic in this regard. He found all of those myths and codified them and looked at them, the Flavian myths. This is one of them. And clearly what they're also doing is they're using Jewish myths they're combining Roman imperial mythology with Jewish scripture, with Jewish prophecy and things like that, the Son of Man prophecy, Jewish apocalyptic imagery, and so forth, the star in the east, that type of mythology. The Flavians appropriate that from the Jews, from the people they defeated in the war. They steal that and they use it as justification. Well, because what they want to do, what they want to establish is that their destruction of the temple, their defeat of the Jews in the war, was by divine provenance, and that this was the means by which God had, even the Jewish God, had approved of the new dynasty of the Flavians. I think that's sort of the thing that's going on there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So in general, do you agree that the Son of Man is likely a reference to Titus, parabolically speaking, or not?
No, I think it's the other way around. The Titus myth, the Titus imagery that's used there is probably stolen from
the Son of Man.
Son of Man, Judeo-Christian mythology, yeah. But I don't go as far as the identification that Joseph Atwill makes known.
So how when you look at the Son of Man in the New Testament, there are some places that appear to conflate him with Jesus, but in more places than not, they're separate characters. What do you think the whole point of that character really is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm really not sure. I really can't work out exactly what's happened there. You're right that there's sort of this cosmic figure, the Son of Man. It's a apocalyptic or figure, and that you can see it being blended, sometimes not very successfully, with a historical figure that's in the text. It's very hard to say exactly what's going on there, isn't it? We're just sort of accustomed to it, the way that the text does that, but actually it's quite weird what's going on there. There's overlays of cosmic prophetic imagery. Once again, it's probably best explained as just the proof text, the Old Testament proof text shining through. The story has been so embedded in Old Testament proof text that it just echoes with it all the time. And the Son of Man sort of imagery is coming through there. I think that's probably what's going on. Isaiah, you know, the prophets, Isaiah in particular, there's a lot of Isaiah in the New Testament imagery and references and allusions. They really work hard to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of those prophecies.
So basically, the Son of Man, in your view, is a cosmic figure. And that reminds me of what 1st and 2nd Enoch say, that the Son of Man is actually Enoch himself. And in 3rd Enoch, they go as far as saying that Metatron is actually Enoch himself, and that he is the lesser Yahweh.
Yep. Yeah, that's because what's happening there is that various sort of spiritual or metaphysical functions are given particular names, and in the canonical text they're sort of bound together, and in the Gnostic text they're separated. So that, for instance, the characterization of Jesus and Son of Man in the canonical text, it invites, certainly in the Gnostic mind, invites the separation of those two things, those two characters, those two functions. And I think that that's happening all the time. And Enoch is one of those functions. Elijah too. Enoch walked with God. He's sort of a character. He's a power that he's very similar to the imams in Shiite Islam. They're in the world but not of the world. They're active in the world but they're removed from the world. They sort of reside in the divine, occluded and obscured. That's a sort of spiritual function that becomes active in Gnostic texts in particular, and in that Enochian tradition especially, of course.
It almost looks to me like Jesus is taking over the role of Enoch, Metatron, as the new lesser Yahweh.
That's right. There's sets of roles here, and different groups are putting different characters into those roles, but often the roles are the same thing. And that's right. One group will put Jesus in that role, and another group will put Enoch in that role. They're sort of interchangeable to some degree.
And that's the other thing. And that takes me to the point that even if one says that or regardless of what one says, that there was or there wasn't a Jesus historically, there could easily have been a Jesus that was crucified by Pilate, because Jesus was a common name. And Pilate was a ruthless governor. He executed a lot of Jews. He was involved in 2 massacres. One at the beginning of his reign, and one more close to the end, practically right at the end, that caused him to get removed from power. The thing is, the Jesus of the New Testament is so different. I suppose that one could say that a guy that got killed during the reign of Pilate that happened to have the same name might have been used to put a chronological anchor for the mythical Jesus.
Indeed.
See, that I think one could still be a mythicist but believe that.
Yeah, you could. The mythicists have got a problem. The Flavian people have got a problem. Their problem is trying to explain why it is that the Flavians, or whoever, decided to situate this story of their mythical Jesus character in the period of Pontius Pilate. The Flavians don't come into power till the 60s. And let's suppose that this sort of construction of myths was done in the 70s, 80s period, say. Why in the 70s or 80s are you constructing a myth set in the period of Pontius Pilate? Why in that period? And they're very specific, the Christian myths, aren't they? They're very particular about which, look at, the Gospel of, it's the Gospel of Luke, that sets the date very, very particularly. We can work out, he wants us to work out the chronology there.
Right.
They want to anchor it in that period. And there must be some reason why. As you say, there might have been a Jesus character that they've sort of attached it to. That happens in literature all the time, where there's a minor figure of that name gets a whole mythology attached to them. That can happen. So maybe that's it. My own view, and I sort of pressed Cliff Carrington on this. It's one of the things we discussed, because I often tried to shoot down his theories. One of the things was that one of the things he came up with was that this is the period in which Josephus is born. That's the period where Josephus is born. That period there, Pontius Pilate and the period when Jesus is around, when the ministry of Jesus, that period, and the crucifixion and so forth. Carrington's surmise was that because it's the period Josephus was born, he doesn't know much about it. And he doesn't say much about it. It's actually a whole period of Josephus that's relatively blank. And Carrington suggested that the story's been put into that hole, into that gap in the history, that there's a gap in Josephus there because it's a period he doesn't know very well. He was too young. He didn't, it doesn't come up in his historical sources. Yeah, that's a good shot. That's a good try to explain why it's anchored in that period. But certainly the Flavian hypothesis needs to explain that. It needs to explain why the story has been backdated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why, like, to me, it doesn't seem to be too problematic to believe in a historical anchor of Jesus instead of saying Jesus was a historical person. And they're using this minor Jewish figure as some sort of Daniel type Messiah that would foretell the greater Messiah that would come down on 70 CE. And Titus is imitating that Messiah, becoming another son of man.
Yeah, there's lots of different possibilities, isn't there? But I don't actually think that it matters whether there's a historical Jesus or not here in some ways, because let's suppose there was, and he was a minor figure, and that he's been heavily mythologized. Then in that case, he's just an anchor to a particular mythology. That's right. He just becomes the historical anchor, and he then explains why the story's been backdated, because they wanted to attach it to that particular anchor. But there's other possibilities. There's all sorts of possibilities. I just think it's good that people consider those possibilities, because it generally doesn't happen in the academic field, or of course in church ecclesiastical scholarship, and it's good that people have test out those particular theories. I think that's what should happen. There should be an open discussion about all sorts of fringe theories and possibilities, and try different things out, because it's a very strange period of history. The texts behave very strange, and it's an important period of history, and I think it can only help for us to speculate about this might have happened or that might have happened, because the question, as I say, most of it's circumstantial. Even the conventional narrative is largely based on circumstantial stuff. So, well, I just think that we need to try different possibilities. That's certainly one possibility, that Titus has picked up that particular motif, and yeah, it could happen like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think we can stop there. I would like to thank you for joining me once again.
Yeah, pleasure.
What I would like to do is I would like to get you together with someone. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work or not. You mentioned a lawyer earlier. I don't know if so, and he happens to have been a lawyer. So I don't know if you're talking about if you met him, James Valiant. Familiar?
No. But okay, that's fine. Yeah. I know the name. I don't know his work.
Yeah, he wrote a book called Creating Christ. It's a different version of Roman provenance.
Yeah.
And if you'll be fine with that, I'd like to get you on with him at some point.
Yeah, certainly. That'd be great.
Okay.
That would be great. Yeah.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.